Alright guys, welcome back to episode 2 of the Piston series. As you remember from the first episode, or if you haven't watched the first episode, we did our engine startup. We taxied over to the run-up area, and now we're holding short of the runway, and we're going to execute an engine run-up. We do the run-up typically first flight of the day, or if the aircraft sits for X amount of hours, you should do a run-up before taking off. So we don't do it every single leg. If you're doing multiple legs, you'll just do it that first leg, and then you consider your run-up checks are good for the next leg. So let's get into it. First thing you want to make sure is when you are doing your engine run-up that your parking brake is set. So to set the parking brake, go ahead and depress your rudder pedals or your brake pedals down, and then pull at the same time that you release them here. So press your pedals down, release the pedals, and pull the parking brake handle. That way you get that hydraulic or the brake fluid into the cylinders, and then you can release the pedals and pull the parking brake, and you'll have it captured. And it's pretty standard on most piston aircraft the way it works like that. So, all right, when we're in the run-up box, first thing we got to do is we got to make sure that our engine our engine oil temperatures are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You can come over here, we can see that the oil temperature Fahrenheit is right about 130 degrees. We're in the green. Perfect. All we need is the pegs off the bottom. So if you're doing winter ops or flying in the wintertime, your oils are going to take a little while to warm up. We want to make sure they're at least above 50 for the engine run-up check. Next thing we got to do is after start, we leaned our mixture. We're going to go ahead and increase that mixture about ½ inch on each engine. Now, depending on your aircraft, they may be exactly the same, they may be staggered, but either way, you want to get just a little bit, about ½ inch of travel mixture into the rich position for the engine run-up. After the mixtures are set, we're going to increase our RPM to 1500. Now, on the ground at idle like this, we're going to control the RPM with the throttle levers. So we're going to go ahead and increase throttle until the RPM reaches 1500. That looks good. So now we got to do a magneto check. Now, if you're unfamiliar with magnetos and what they are, very simplified explanation is the magneto in each engine creates an electrical current. That current is created every time the propeller cycles. So as soon as the propeller turns, it creates an electrical current within the magneto. That magneto then sends that power to the spark plugs in each cylinder for the engine. Now, each cylinder has 2 spark plugs from each magneto. So if you have one magneto that's out or not working, your engine is still going to work, but you're going to notice a decrease in RPM from that engine. That's why we have 2 of them running to each cylinder. That way we have redundancy on the aircraft. The magneto is a self-sustaining system, very simple, and it will keep power running to the engines even if you shut off your battery power and your avionics. Your engines are still getting electrical current because they are self-sustaining with that magneto. Alright, so the magneto check, what we're checking for is drops in RPM that are within limits. We want to make sure that the magnetos for each engine are working. So we're going to observe a drop in RPM. So let's go ahead and set the RPMs back. Drifted a little bit on me there, so we know exactly where our baseline is. And for the left engine, we're going to go ahead and turn off the... for the left and right engine, we're going to turn off magneto 1. So left. And there is a drop in RPM. I'll go ahead and turn those back on. RPM comes back up. I'll try to lock my throttles, they're moving on me. There we go, and we're going to check the right. There's a drop of RPM. Come back on. So now we know that each magneto is working to their full potential for each engine. We're observing a drop of no more than 125 RPM, and the difference between the 2 engines has got to be within 50. So you can see when we shut off magneto 1, it's identical. They are staying together. So they're working as intended. Alright, next thing we need to do is we need to check our ammeters, and we need to make sure that we're getting proper electrical load distribution to the aircraft. Can't really test our load by pressing the left and right ammeter We can just kind of simulate it here. What we would be looking for was by pressing the left ammeter, we would press and hold this push button here, load up the electrical current on the aircraft, and we would see a slight rise in the ammeter. Then we would press the right and then go ahead and turn everything off, and you would see the rise and decrease as well. Now, unfortunately, we can't press the load push buttons here to get a full simulation, but you did see some jumping when we were moving these electrical outlets there on the amper, so you can see that they do draw current from the aircraft. So not a full test that we can do there with the load, but that's good enough. We want to make sure that they were working. Also, what we would do in addition is go ahead and activate the surface de-ice boots, and we would visually check to see if the boots were inflating on the edge of the wings. Alright, after we've checked our magnetos and we've checked the electrical load, we're going to go ahead and come over to the right side of the cockpit here, and we want to make sure we have proper suction, gyro pressure, want to make sure it's in the green. In a Chieftain, if you're flying the actual Chieftain, your gyro suction is a little bit higher. It's 5.1 to 5.9 in HG. For the Navajo, it's a little bit less, looks to be about 4.3-ish and up. But as long as we're in the green, we know we have enough gyro pressure that we have good suction. So we want to verify that is in the green. Engine gauges, obviously check, make sure everything is now in the green. At this point, we want to make sure our oil temperatures are into the green and not in the yellow. The reason we're going to verify that is because now we're going to do a propeller check. So to check the propellers, we're going to grab the left prop and we're going to cycle the propeller to the feather position and then back to the full forward position. Now we don't want the propeller to actually feather, so we do this relatively quickly, observing a drop in RPM, making sure that the hub is working and that we're cycling oil through the propeller hub. The outside air temperature will determine how many cycles of the propeller we're going to do. So if your outside air temperature is above 50 degrees, we're going to do one cycle. If it is below 50 degrees, and between and above 32 degrees, we're going to do 2 cycles. If it's below freezing, we're going to actually do 4 cycles of the propeller. To check our outside air temperature, we're actually going to look over here on the window, and we can see air temp is, so we've got Celsius on the inner ring and Fahrenheit on the outer ring. So the inner ring is Celsius. We're looking at, oh, it looks to be about 50, or no, it looks about 15 Celsius. So Fahrenheit, it is greater than 50 Fahrenheit. It's right at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're going to do 2 cycles. We're going to say it's between 32 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're going to do 2 cycles for each engine. So we're going to go ahead and grab the left prop lever. We're going to do 2 cycles for each engine. There comes the RPM. Get it back up. Don't let it actually feather. Now we've cycled oil in the hub for engine 1, same thing for engine 2. Rule of thumb is you don't want to let it drop below 1,000 RPM. Alright, so why are we testing these propeller hubs? What is happening inside these engines that's causing us to do this test? Also, if you're unfamiliar, you're also probably wondering why we have blue levers. Now, hopefully you're familiar with constant speed propellers. We're going to touch on a very basic propeller discussion before we get into the in-depth turbocharger discussion. Now, what's happening in these hubs is very complex, but it's very simple at the same time. So on your standard Cessna 172, or any engine that is not a constant speed propeller, your propeller blade is fixed at a constant pitch. You cannot change the angle of attack on the propeller. In a constant speed propeller, we can. We can demonstrate that by looking at this diagram here. This diagram actually shows us what's happening inside the propeller hub. Here is our propeller blade, and if you notice, the propeller blade cross section is actually an airfoil. It looks just like a wing, right? We have a camber over the top, flat bottom, leading edge, trailing edge. Now, when we're cycling the propeller levers, this is what's happening inside the hub. We are taking oil from the engine-driven pump, and we're pushing it into the hub. As we push oil into the hub, it's going to push against this piston, which will push back on this spring here and this arm and change the pitch of the propeller. Now, why do we want to do this? That is because this is the best way to get maximum performance out of a propeller. When we're on the ground or in high RPM conditions, we don't want a lot of drag on the prop, right? So we're in what's known as fine pitch or high RPM. The propeller will be straight up and down. It's just going to be minimum drag, minimum angle of attack, and high RPM. Now, as the aircraft accelerates, we can get more performance out of the propeller by increasing the angle of attack. We do that by moving the propeller into a higher angle of attack position or a lower RPM. We do that by pulling the prop lever back. We pull the prop lever back, oil flows into the hub, we push this piston back, and it will increase the angle of attack on the prop. Now, one thing to note here is when we talk about feathering, why do we want to feather this propeller? Feathering a propeller means that this pitch is going to be completely full feathered or full pitch. And what happens is you will have your propeller blades almost sticking straight out. The reason we want them sticking out or vertically is so that we have minimum drag on the aircraft. Now, if we lose an engine, we need to have less drag as possible because we have one engine remaining and we need to be able to find a safe place to land the aircraft.
All right, guys, so this is a very complex discussion, and in the real world, it actually takes several days of ground school and flight instruction and practical tests to actually fully comprehend what's going on within the propeller hub. This is just a very basic, simplified overview so you guys get a general idea of what's happening inside of these propeller hubs as we're moving these levers. Without getting too much in depth about feathering an engine, all you need to know is if your engine fails and your propeller is in max RPM or full forward pitch, that is going to cause significant drag, so much so that you can actually lose control of the aircraft. It is therefore the reason why we test this feathering mechanism and make sure the prop is functioning properly. If an engine fails and we cannot restart the engine, we will then elect to feather the propeller, which will then cause the propeller blade to reach its maximum angle of attack or near vertical position, creating the least amount of drag over the blades as the aircraft flies to its emergency landing spot. I hope this kind of gives you a small insight of what's going on so we can really fully appreciate this aircraft as we see all these little subsystems and microsystems that are actually working. We just don't really know about them when you look at the airplane at face value.
All right, so let's talk about turbochargers. Now that we understand a little bit about the propeller and how it's a constant speed propeller, which will allow us to get maximum performance from the blade, now we want to get maximum performance from our engine. This is what makes this Piper Chieftain and Navajo so powerful for being a piston-driven aircraft. When you look at an aircraft that does not have a turbocharger or supercharger, we are limited to density, altitude being a major factor in engine performance. When you have an engine that's rated at 300 horsepower, that is based on a standard day at sea level. As the aircraft climbs, your horsepower will decrease because you're no longer getting the same density of air into the engine. As you climb up in altitude, the density of the air decreases, the molecules are further apart, decreasing the performance on the engine. So while yes, we can get additional performance by having a constant speed propeller, we're going to get max performance from our propeller blade, we're still going to be limited on our horsepower from the engine. We can have a constant speed propeller at 10,000 feet with an engine that's rated at 300 horsepower at sea level. You may only be getting about 150 horsepower at 10,000 feet. So it is a very significant decrease in horsepower with altitude, especially when you apply other factors such as non-standard temperature. We can have much higher temperatures, much higher density altitudes. You can really negatively affect the performance of a naturally aspirated engine. The best way to get maximum performance from your engine is to introduce a forced induction system. That leads us to turbochargers and superchargers. We're not going to talk about superchargers today because the Piper Navajo and Chieftain are equipped with what's known as a turbocharger. Piper Navajo and Chieftain are equipped with the J2B turbocharging system. The main difference between the turbocharger and the supercharger is that the supercharger will actually use the engine-driven power to spin a compressor, whereas the turbocharger will take exhaust air to spin a turbine, which will spin the compressor. So looking at our J2B turbocharger, this is not, keep in mind, this is not the exact turbocharger system that we have in the aircraft, but this is just so you can understand a little bit about what's going on. We know that we have to do one thing to get more horsepower at altitude, and that is to create the same level of density air which you would find on a standard day at sea level. So how do we do that? We have to compress the low density air at altitude into a higher density to make sure we get maximum performance from our engine. We do this by taking exhaust air that is propelled from the engine. We're going to take that air and we're going to route it one of two ways. We are either going to let some of it come out of a wastegate, or we're going to let some of it come through the exhaust manifold, pass through a turbine, and out the exhaust. Now we're going to come back to the wastegate here momentarily. So for the sake of the discussion, ignore what you see here. We take the exhaust air, we route it through its piping, we spin it through a turbine. As the exhaust spins up this turbine, we are then going to create a force up here that is transferred through the shaft to spin this compressor. As the compressor spins, it's also going to receive new air from the ambient air inlet. The air that's coming from the ambient air inlet is going to pass into this compressor and become very dense. The dense air, once it has been spun around in the compressor, is then going to be routed into what's called the upper deck. Upper deck air is very important. Upper deck air is where we're going to get our power. The upper deck air is going to be routed one of three ways. Some of that upper deck air is going to go down to what's called the absolute pressure controller. For the sake of this discussion, let's ignore the absolute pressure controller and continue following the flow of upper deck air. The upper deck air will then pass through an overboost control valve. The overboost control valve is exactly what it sounds like. If there gets to be too much pressure in the upper deck, the overboost control valve will allow air to escape at a regulated rate, releasing pressure in the upper deck, avoiding a possible catastrophic failure. It is not a constant release of pressure in the overboost control valve. It is only once pressures reach a preset threshold that it will be released through the overboost control valve. So the majority of the air, if not all of it, is going to continue coming from the compressor through the upper deck and pass through the throttle butterfly. The throttle butterfly is exactly what that implies. It is the position of your throttle. You open the throttle, this valve will become parallel, allowing maximum amount of upper deck air to pass through. If you close the throttle, the butterfly valve will close, minimizing the amount of upper deck air to pass through the throttle butterfly valve. The air that passes the throttle butterfly valve is then going to go past one more part in the upper deck. We have the manifold pressure gauge. The manifold pressure gauge is going to read the amount of pressure that is passing through the upper deck. You may be familiar with manifold pressure because when you look at our aircraft, we have something called a manifold pressure gauge. The manifold pressure gauge is measured in inches of mercury. Once we know what manifold pressure was being read, the air is going to continue to pass down its piping into the induction part of the piston. This high density air is then going to be sucked in, mixed with fuel, compressed in the engine, ignited, and then extracted out the exhaust. The process will then begin to repeat itself. We have successfully taken low density air, routed it through the exhaust, spun up a turbine, which translated that power to spin a compressor, which then took ambient air, made that air dense, sent it through the upper deck, moderated by our throttle position, checked by our manifold pressure gauge, and forced back into the engine. So now our engine is being fed high density air at any altitude. Now, that is the basic flow, the exhaust air, and how we turn exhaust air into power to drive a compressor and give us density air in the engine. There's a couple other things we need to review. How do we know how much pressure we want to be able to have sent to the engine? We don't just want to spin up maximum compression and overboost the engine. That would be inefficient and would cause extreme stress on the aircraft and cause catastrophic failure to the engine. So what happens is we have what's called wastegate control. So now let's talk about the wastegate and the butterfly valve. As air comes into the lower deck, some of that air is going to pass a wastegate or butterfly valve. The wastegate and wastegate actuator are directly linked with the absolute pressure controller. We don't want to have unlimited pressure being forced into our engine cylinder. If that would happen, we would obviously have engine failure on our engine. We don't want to feed it an unlimited amount of pressure. We have to regulate the amount of pressure we're sending to the engine. When I say pressure, I mean dense air that we want to be sent to the engine. So how do we regulate that? That leads us to the wastegate butterfly valve. As you recall, we have air coming in through here from the exhaust, and we said it's going to go one of two ways. It is either going to go through the wastegate controller, or it is going to pass through the turbine and out the exhaust. The wastegate butterfly valve controls the amount of turbocharging power the engine will feel. The wastegate is spring-loaded to a fully open position. With the wastegate fully open, we're going to allow all of our air to pass through the wastegate butterfly valve and out of the back of the engine. This will occur without spooling up the turbine, or any residual air would be minimal and not creating induction. This air will then pass out, and we will operate just like a naturally aspirated engine. Air comes in, passes through the exhaust, out the wastegate, and into the atmosphere. Now, as the wastegate closes, we are then going to route less air out of the wastegate and send it through the turbine. With the wastegate fully closed, we're going to get maximum turbocharging power, as all the exhaust air is going to be routed through the turbine and then out one of the exhaust tailpipes. Now that we know that the wastegate controls the amount of turbocharging power that we're going to give to the engine, we must understand how the wastegate butterfly valve is controlled. This can vary amongst turbochargers. For this discussion and simplicity, we're going to talk about the absolute pressure controller. The absolute pressure controller can be considered to be the brain of the turbocharger. The absolute pressure controller consists of several parts. We can have a series of bellows and oil. What happens in the absolute pressure controller is it will regulate how much oil will be returned to the engine oil sump and how much oil will be sent to the wastegate actuator. Let's look at the basic flow of oil through the turbocharger. Engine oil comes in through the engine oil pump, passes through the wastegate actuator, continues up through its piping, and meets the absolute pressure controller. If the absolute pressure controller closed, or the poppet valve is in a position that allows minimum oil, what will happen is that oil is going to be forced out, will come down through a series of piping, and fed back into the wastegate actuator and increase pressure on the wastegate actuator. As the wastegate actuator moves in this diagram to the right, we're going to close the butterfly valve. Once the butterfly valve is closed, we know that we're going to be getting maximum turbocharging power. Let's look at that again in the reverse configuration. If we have engine oil coming through the engine oil pump up to the absolute pressure controller, what will happen is the oil will then be routed straight back to the engine oil return, bypassing the wastegate actuator, into the sump, back into the pump, allowing the spring in the wastegate actuator to move in this diagram to the left, opening the butterfly valve, allowing maximum airflow to pass through the wastegate control, creating minimum turbine pressure and expelling out the exhaust of the engine. So now that we have talked about the flow of oil in relation to the wastegate actuator, let's talk about the brain of the absolute pressure controller. The absolute pressure controller can be comprised of a series of bellows filled with air, or in the Lycoming case, nitrogen. Why do we use nitrogen? Because it will actually sense the difference in temperature as well. We can calibrate the bellows to allow a certain amount of pressure to pass through the upper deck. The APC, absolute pressure controller, is calibrated to allow just the optimum amount of dense air to pass through and into the turbocharger. So let's recap what we've learned. We know we're going to take induction air. It's going to pass out the exhaust. It's going to determine if it's going to go from the wastegate or out the turbine. If we were in a maximum turbocharging condition, the wastegate would be closed. All air would then proceed through the turbine, spinning up the turbine, exiting out the exhaust. The turbine connected to the shaft here will then spin the compressor, taking ambient air, compressing that ambient air, and sending it into the upper deck. As the upper deck air comes over the APC, we're going to sense which pressure we are at. As that air passes through the upper deck, we're going to be staged at the throttle butterfly valve. If we are at maximum turbocharging position, the throttle butterfly valve will most likely be in the fully open position, allowing maximum upper deck air to pass through the throttle butterfly. We'll get to read our manifold pressures from our manifold pressure gauge as is checked at this point. That dense air that is calibrated from the APC to be the exact density required to get maximum performance from the engine at its current altitude and outside air temperature will then be fed into the piston, compressed, ignited, and sent right back out the exhaust. Now I hope that is clear as mud for you guys, and I know that this is a very simplified explanation of a turbocharger. We are not going to talk too in depth about some of the very complex processes that take place, but I just wanted you guys to have a general idea of how this turbocharger works. The last thing we need to note is that this turbocharging system is going to create lots of heat within bearings and spinning mechanical parts. So much so that we need approximately 5 to 6 gallons of oil continuously flowing through the engine to keep the turbocharging process cool. With that being said, you can understand that the engine oil is the lifeblood of this turbocharging system. And without oil pressure, we can have an overheat condition and create damage and catastrophic failure to our engine. All right, back in our aircraft now, we've talked a little bit about our constant speed propellers. We've also talked about manifold pressure and how the manifold pressure is related to our turbocharging system and how we're going to get maximum performance from our engine at all altitudes. Now I hope that you have understood a little bit about the turbocharging and the workings of what's going on behind the scenes in this wonderful aircraft. After we've cycled the engines and we've cycled oil through the hub we will now bring the engines back down to 1,000 RPM. After the engine run-up has been completed, release the parking brake, taxi light on, and taxi to the runway. As we're cleared for takeoff, we'll go ahead and get all our external lights on right here. As we take the runway, we're also going to go ahead and turn on our overhead fuel pumps. Once we are lined up on the runway, we're ready for takeoff. We're going to hold the brakes, let our propeller spin up to about 1800 RPM, release the brakes, and slowly increase the throttle to full. As the throttle increases, our propellers are going to reach the red line. Make sure that they stabilize there via the governors, and set takeoff power. Make sure to not overboost the engine. As you can see, it's possible here with going over red line. At 100 knots, we're going to rotate the aircraft. Positive rate, gear up. It's important to note that you're not overboosting the engines at this phase. One thing to note is on takeoff roll, you want to make sure that you get full throttle forward, but that you don't overboost the engines. As you bring your throttles up to full throttle, there is a tendency to have a slight overboost, so you want to make sure that you give the overpressure controller and the density controller enough time to correct for the pressures that the aircraft is feeling. About a 1 to 2 second delay and you should be able to have maximum throttle forward within red line. You want to be able to make sure that your throttles are full forward and that you're not exceeding red line. That's actually a density controller check. If we were exceeding red line here, it would be a maintenance item. We'd have to write it up and they would adjust the controllers in the engine to make sure that we're not exceeding red line or exceeding maximum pressure. At about 1,000 feet above the field elevation, we can go ahead and do a climb flow. We'll go ahead and turn our fuel pumps off. Reduce our engine throttle to about 42 inches. And begin our climb out. We're looking to maintain right about 120 knots or so in the climb. You can see the engine this aircraft is extremely powerful, so you'll be able to climb very rapidly, especially at light loads. Once we are between 2,000 and 3,000 feet above field, we're going to lower the nose about 5 degrees, which will translate to approximately around 130 or so indicated. Once we have begun lowering the nose, we want to make sure you don't descend here, but you're slowing your climb to pitch for about 130 or so. We're going to do our climb flow. Once we've reached about 2,000 to 3,000 above field, we want to make sure we do an additional part to our climb flow. We're actually going to switch the tanks at this point. The fuel tanks in the Piper Chieftain are designed to burn from the outboards first, and then the inboards second. So, in order to change fuel tanks, we have to follow a procedure. We're going to turn on our engine-driven fuel pumps, and then we're going to move our fuel selector levers to the outboard position. We want to do it with the left engine first. Verify that we have maintained our fuel pressure and our fuel flow, and then we would do it with the right engine, and then we can shut our fuel pumps off. You don't want to do both engines at the same time, because if you don't have fuel tanks, or if your external tanks aren't filled, or for some reason the engine doesn't want to feed from the outer tank, you don't want to have a dual engine failure. You'd be able to catch it if the first one goes out. So we'll unpause the sim here. We've got our pumps on. We've moved that to the outboard position. We'll go ahead and turn the left pump off. Our fuel flow is the same. We'll go ahead and move our right fuel selector to outboard. And go ahead and kill that fuel pump. Fuel flow is looking good. Everything is looking good. Alright, last thing to note here as we are climbing out, we want to set our climb power, which we're going to be at For us, we're at about 38 inches of manifold pressure, and we're going to go ahead and bring those props back down to 2400 RPM. Now, if you start getting that whoa, 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 that means that your propellers are out of sync, and the Piper Chieftain and Navajo do not actually have a propeller sync, so you're going to have to manually adjust your propeller levels to match exactly. So go ahead and just play with your props to find that sweet spot. You can hear it there, a little bit more on the left. That's about as good as we're going to get it. Right now we're climbing out about 130 knots, and we're going to make sure our EGTs are within limits. Our fuel flow should be just under 24 gallons an hour per side. That looks good. And lastly, we want to check and make sure that our cylinder head temperatures are in the green, which they are, 300, nice and level. And there you have it. We have successfully done our run-up. We're taking off. We are climbing out now about 140 knots. As you continue to climb an altitude, you're going to notice your manifold pressure will continue to drop. That's because the air is getting less dense, right? But we have that turbocharger that we spent all that time talking about. Let's increase the demand for power. We're going to bump it right back up to 38 inches. And there you go. As you continue to climb, that will continue to drop off until we reach our peak turbocharging altitude, which means you'll be full forward with the throttles, and you'll still be hopefully right at 38 where you need to maintain. Alright guys, that's going to wrap up this video. I do apologize for getting a little bit lengthy there, but I find it important to talk about these systems on this aircraft because without understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface of the skin of the aircraft, you cannot fully enjoy the modeling and the fully simulated systems that we have working for us here in the Navajo Chieftain. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I will catch you again on the next one very soon. Y'all have a blessed day wherever you are.